We will be seeking to hold David to answer for 3 felony counts of which he has been charged. First-degree murder with special circumstances, count of lewd and lascivious acts with a 13-year-old, and the count of mutilation of human remains.
In September 2025, workers at a Los Angeles tow yard reported a smell coming from an impounded car. It was a Tesla, ticketed, then towed off a quiet Hollywood street. It had been handled, logged, moved, and no one realized what was inside until that smell. Inside were the remains of a girl. Her name was Celeste Rivas Hernandez. She was 14, found one day after what would have been her 15th birthday. She had been reported missing more than a year before anyone found her. For months, the public was told almost nothing. No cause of death, no name released, just a sealed file. This week, it reached a courtroom. Prosecutors laid out their evidence. The DNA, the phone data, the purchases. It looked like enough. Then the defense stood up. This is quiet record. Stay with us, because this case is not as settled as it sounds. To understand how this case reached a courtroom, you have to start with the car. Because the car is what broke everything open. In late July of 2025, a black Tesla Model X was parked on a residential street in the Hollywood Hills. Nothing about it looked wrong. It was one more expensive car on one more quiet street in one of the most photographed cities on Earth. It didn't move. On the 28th of August, it was ticketed, flagged for violating a 72-hour parking limit. Still, it didn't move. In the first days of September, the city did what cities do with abandoned cars. It towed it. The Tesla was hauled to an impound lot and logged into a system, one vehicle among hundreds. And there it might have stayed, except for the smell. On September 8th, staff at the tow yard reported an odor coming from the vehicle. When investigators from the Los Angeles Police Department opened it, they found human remains inside the front storage compartment, the space where an engine would normally sit. The remains belonged to a young woman. She had been there long enough that identifying her was not simple. It took the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner until September 16th to confirm who she was. And the confirmation came the way these confirmations often do when time has taken the obvious answers away, through forensic dental examination. The girl in the car was Celeste Rivas Hernandez, 14 years old. Here is the detail the lap would later confirm, and the one that lands hardest. This was not a hidden car in a hidden place. It had been ticketed by the city, towed by the city, cataloged by the city. It sat in the machinery of Los Angeles for days, and no one knew what it carried until decomposition forced the question. The car was registered to a name the public would recognize within hours, and that is where an ordinary impound became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in the country. Because the person that Tesla was registered to was not anonymous. He was famous. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand who Celeste was first, before the headlines, before the hearing, before her name became a hashtag. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was born on the 7th of September, 2010. She was from Lake Elsinore, a working-class city in Riverside County, more than an hour's drive east of Los Angeles, far enough that the glass towers of the city might as well have been another country. Her parents had immigrated from El Salvador. She was first-generation American, one of several children, raised in a Christian household. She had a brother and an older sister. Her mother's name is Mercedes. Her father's name is Jesus. She attended Lakeland Village School. In the photographs her family has shared, she is a child. Braces. A shy, closed-mouth smile. The ordinary face of an ordinary teenager who should have had every year ahead of her. She did not. And here is the part of Celeste's story that has to be said plainly, because it is the part that turns grief into something sharper. Celeste was reported missing more than once, long before her body was ever found. According to Riverside County Sheriff's records, she was first reported missing in February of 2024, when she was 13. That time, she came home. Records show she returned a few days later. She was reported missing again that April. Her family's last confirmed contact with her came in May of 2024. Sit with that timeline for a moment. A 13-year-old girl vanishes, comes back, vanishes again. And the last time anyone in her family is certain they spoke to her, it is the spring of 2024, nearly a year and a half before that Tesla was opened in a tow yard. For all that time, Celeste was somewhere. Digital evidence that would later surface in court suggested she was alive well into 2024 and even early 2025. She was out there, she was 14, and the question that haunts this entire case, the question her family has had to live inside, is how a child from Lake Elsinore, reported missing to her local sheriff, ended up dead in a car registered to a rising music star in Hollywood. To answer that, prosecutors would point to a connection that they say began years earlier. Online, in the places where a lonely kid and a young man building an empire could find each other, and where no parent was watching. His name is David Anthony Burke. The world knows him as D4vd, spelled with a 4, pronounced simply David. In the summer of 2025, he was 21 years old, and he was ascending fast. Burke was born in Queens, New York, and raised largely in Houston, Texas. He was homeschooled from around the 8th grade. He sang in a church choir, a gospel foundation that you can still hear underneath his records. And like a lot of his generation, his path to music ran through a video game. He started making songs around 2021 to score his own gameplay footage online, after the copyrighted music he'd been using kept getting his videos flagged. Then one of those songs caught fire. Romantic Homicide, released in 2022, went viral and climbed onto the Billboard Hot 100. It was the kind of break most artists wait a lifetime for, and never get. Before he was old enough to legally drink, Burke had signed with Darkroom and Interscope Records, the same label ecosystem behind some of the biggest names in the industry. A publishing deal followed. More hits followed. Here With Me, songs that crossed 1 billion streams. By April of 2025, he had released his debut album and launched a world tour behind it. That autumn, he was announced as the voice of an official anthem for one of the biggest video games on the planet, the very kind of game that had launched him in the first place. He had millions of followers. He had, by the accounting later presented in court, earned somewhere between $6 and $19 million, depending on how you counted the deal. He had, in other words, everything to protect. And here is what makes that word protect sit so heavily over this case. Within days of that Tesla being opened, all of it would vanish. The tour, canceled. The record label, gone. The video game anthem, pulled. Artists who had recorded with him quietly scrubbed the collaborations. The machine that had lifted a homeschooled kid from Houston to the top of the charts dropped him the instant that trunk was opened. Everything he had built came apart in about a week. But that collapse was still in the future. Because roughly 18 months before that Tesla was towed, Burke had a recorded encounter with law enforcement. An encounter that no one paid attention to at the time, but that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It happened at his front door. It was captured on a deputy's body camera, and in it, a rising star answered questions about a missing 13-year-old girl. In February of 2024, a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy named Juan Gonzalez went to a home in the Hollywood area for a welfare check. Celeste Rivas Hernandez had been reported missing. Her family had gone through her phone records, and a number in those records led investigators to David Anthony Burke. So a deputy knocked on his door. The body camera was running. And what it captured, played in open court more than 2 years later, is one of the strangest and most telling artifacts in this case, not because of anything graphic, but because of how ordinary it looks. Burke answers the door. He is cooperative. By the deputy's own later account, he is extremely cooperative. He lets them look around the home. He talks about how he says he knew Celeste, that they met online, through the kinds of apps teenagers and young adults use, years earlier. He tells the deputies he had met her once in person. And then he says the line that the entire courtroom would fixate on. He says, of Celeste, she told me she was 18. And then, almost in the same breath, everybody's telling me she was 13. The deputies found no sign of the girl in the home that day. They left. One of them can be heard expressing hope that she'd be found. And Burke's career continued its climb, uninterrupted, for another 1.5 years. Now, I want to be careful and precise here, because this is where the case turns from a missing person story into something far darker, and precision is the whole point of this channel. Prosecutors allege that the relationship between David Burke and Celeste Rivas was not what a stranger at the door would assume. They allege it was sexual and that it began when Celeste was 13. Those are allegations. Burke has pleaded not guilty. He is presumed innocent, and a preliminary hearing does not decide guilt. But that recording, a young man telling sheriff's deputies that a missing child told me she was 18, while acknowledging everyone else was telling him she was 13, is not an allegation. It is a recording. It exists. It was played for a judge, and it is the reason prosecutors say this was never a mystery to one person in that courtroom. Before we go further, this is a good moment to say one thing directly. Quiet record exists because cases like this one get buried, sensationalized, or turned into rumor mills where a 14-year-old girl becomes a punchline. If you believe a case like Celeste deserves to be told carefully, verified, sourced, and without the gore, subscribe. Not for us, for the standard. There's a lot more that has to be told carefully here, and the next part is where the evidence gets heavy. For nearly 2 years, the public knew almost nothing. The medical examiner's report was sealed by the court. The cause of death was withheld. A grand jury was convened behind closed doors. And into that silence rushed everything silence attracts. Rumors, half-facts, viral theories, claims that were later flatly contradicted by the lapid. Some of what circulated online in those months was simply invented. This is the quiet cost of a sealed case. When the facts are locked away, the vacuum does not stay empty. It fills with the loudest guess, and a 14-year-old girl becomes the raw material for other people's speculation. That is exactly the machinery this channel exists to push back against, which is why we waited for the courtroom and why we're only telling you now what was actually said under oath. The preliminary hearing in July of 2026 was the first time the prosecution's actual theory of the case was laid out in the open. So let's walk through what they say happened, and let's keep the word allege attached to it, because that is exactly what it still is. Prosecutors say that by the spring of 2025, David Burke's career had never been higher, and that Celeste Rivas had become a threat to it. They allege that on the 22nd of April 2025, the two exchanged a long series of text messages, an argument. And they allege that in that argument, Celeste threatened to expose their relationship. Prosecutors allege that the next day, Burke arranged a ride to bring Celeste from Lake Elsinore into the Hollywood Hills. And they allege that at his home, he killed her, to keep her quiet, to protect the career he had spent years building. What is not an allegation is the medical finding. A deputy medical examiner, Dr. Grant Ho, testified that Celeste's death was a homicide and that she died of 2 penetrating wounds to the upper body. The severe decomposition, the result of how long she went undiscovered, took many of the finer answers away. But the manner of death was not in question. This was a killing. Prosecutors put a motive on the record, and they put a number on it. Financial witnesses, including a senior finance executive from Burke's label named Louis Poimeru, testified about the scale of what Burke stood to lose. A record deal valued in the millions, payments already made, a career at its peak. The state's theory is blunt. A 14-year-old girl stood between a young man and everything he had earned, and he chose the career. That is the prosecution's story of the killing. But it was never the part that made this case notorious. What made it notorious, what kept it sealed and secret for so long, was what prosecutors say happened after. This is the part of the case that has to be handled with care, and I'm going to handle it the way this channel always does, by telling you what the evidence is, without dwelling on the horror of it. You don't need the details to understand the gravity. You need the facts. Prosecutors allege that after Celeste's death, David Burke went to significant lengths to conceal it. And the spine of that allegation is a paper trail, a series of purchases, they say, made under names that were not his own. Investigators testified that in the days and weeks after the alleged killing, items were ordered under 2 aliases, Travion Davis and Victoria Martinez. A shovel, chainsaws, heavy-duty bags, a body bag, an inflatable pool. Later, an incinerator, described in court as a burn cage. Prosecutors allege these were the tools of concealment and that Celeste's body was dismembered and hidden. I'm going to leave the specifics there because the specifics are not what matters to you as a viewer. What matters is that investigators say they can tie those purchases and a place together. And this is the thread that is hardest to shake. An lab detective who works in cellular analysis, William Roker, testified about data pulled from Burke's phone and from the Tesla itself. He told the court that the phone and the car did not just sit in Hollywood. They traveled, together, more than once, out of the city and up to a remote stretch of State Route 154, a winding mountain road in Santa Barbara County. Not once, repeatedly. The kind of trip that has a purpose. And then, months later, in January of 2026, long after Celeste had been found, a Caltrans worker doing ordinary roadside work along that same remote route found something in the dirt. Celeste's passport card, her identification, miles from Lake Elsinore, miles from Hollywood. Along the exact road prosecutors say the phone and the car had traveled, again and again. Of everything in this case, that quiet detail, a child's passport, found by a road crew on a mountain highway nearly a year later, may be the one that stays with you longest. Then there was the car itself. When criminalists processed that Tesla, one of them, Chelsea Murillo, testified that it contained at least 11 air fresheners scattered through the console, the seat pockets, the compartment where Celeste was found. The prosecution's implication was clear, an attempt to cover an odor that could not be covered. Laid out in a row like that, it sounds airtight. A motive, a body, a cause of death, a trail of purchases under fake names, location data linking the car to a remote road, a passport found along that road, air fresheners in the vehicle. It sounds like more than enough to send a man to trial, maybe more than enough to convict him. And then the defense stood up and started pulling on the threads. David Burke's lead attorney is Blair Burke, one of the most formidable defense lawyers in Los Angeles, the kind of attorney the famous call when everything is on the line. And at the preliminary hearing, Burke and her team were not there to tell an alternative story. That is not what a preliminary hearing is for. They were there to do something narrower and in some ways more dangerous to the prosecution, to show the judge the holes. Start with the DNA, because the DNA is the strongest thing the state has, and the defense knew it. And lapid DNA analyst, Samantha Tosh, testified that blood matching Celeste was found in the garage of the home, on a floor mat, on a piece of exercise equipment, on a tarp, on a Tesla charging cable. And the statistical strength of that match was staggering. The analyst put it at roughly 1 septillion times more likely to be Celeste's than a random person's. A 1, followed by 24 zeros. That is a devastating number, and the defense did not try to fight the number. Instead, Burke asked a different question. Whose house was this, really? Because more than one person lived at that residence. Burke established it directly with a criminalist on the stand, that investigators were aware multiple people lived there, and once that fact is on the record, the blood in the garage stops answering the most important question. It proves Celeste was there. It does not by itself prove who did it. Then the defense went after what wasn't tested. There was a blue iPhone, one the defense suggested may have belonged to Celeste, and may have held information that pointed somewhere other than their client. It was not tested for his DNA. There were 2 chainsaws recovered, and when they were examined, they tested negative for blood. There was that burn cage, found, according to the defense, unopened. Never used, never tested. They pressed on the fingerprints and the so-called touch DNA, the trace evidence a person leaves simply by handling an object. On item after item, the defense asked the same quiet, corrosive question. Was it tested for our client specifically? And again, the answer exposed a gap. Evidence collected is not the same as evidence connected. A chainsaw in a house proves someone owned a chainsaw. It does not, on its own, put it in anyone's hands. And then there was the location data, the phone and the Tesla, traveling out to Santa Barbara County. On cross-examination, the defense established the limits of that evidence with a single line of questioning. The analysis was built on call records and the car's network data. It was not GPS. And crucially, it could not tell the court who was driving. The phone was there, the car was there, but the data cannot put David Burke's hands on the wheel. Legal analysts watching the hearing, including former federal prosecutors, described what the defense was doing with a phrase that comes up in cases like this one, laying the groundwork for Some other dude did it. The suggestion, never stated outright, that someone else in that house, someone else in Burke's orbit, could be responsible. And investigators themselves had acknowledged, from early in the case, that more than one person may have been involved in concealing Celeste's body. So here is where that leaves us. The prosecution has a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and one genuinely powerful piece of physical proof. The defense has not disproven any of it, but they have opened a real question about whether it points at their client specifically, or simply at the house he lived in. Which brings us to the only question that actually matters right now. Not is he guilty, that is not what is being decided. The question is whether it's enough to go forward at all, and to answer that, you have to understand the very specific, very low bar this hearing was built around. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this channel doesn't do the screaming version of these stories. Do me one favor before the last stretch. Leave a comment when we get to the question at the end. The comments on these cases are where the real conversation happens, and this one deserves a real one. Here is the thing most people misunderstand about what happened in that courtroom. A preliminary hearing is not a trial. There is no jury. The defendant does not have to put on a defense. And the standard the judge is applying is not beyond a reasonable doubt, the high bar you know from every courtroom drama. The standard is probable cause. And it is a low bar by design. The judge, in this case, Judge Charlene Olmedo, is not being asked whether David Burke is guilty. She is being asked a much smaller question. Is there enough evidence here that a reasonable person could believe these charges might be true? Enough to justify putting the case in front of a jury someday? That distinction matters enormously, because it means the defense can win every individual argument about doubt, the untested phone, the unknown driver, the shared house, and the case can still move forward. Probable cause does not require certainty. It requires plausibility, and the charges it's being measured against are as serious as they come. David Burke is charged with murder, charged in a way that makes this a capital case. Attached to that murder charge are what the law calls special circumstances. The allegation that this was the murder of a witness, that it was committed for financial gain, and that it involved lying in wait. Each of those, if ultimately proven, elevates the stakes to the highest the justice system holds. He is also charged with the continuous sexual abuse of a child under the age of 14, the formal charge underlying the allegations about his relationship with Celeste, and he is charged with the unlawful mutilation of human remains. Because of those special circumstances, this is a case where the district attorney could ultimately seek the death penalty. The district attorney, Nathan Hochman, has said that decision will come later. For now, Burke remains held without bail. So that is the real weight of what Judge Olmedo has to decide. Not the ending. Just whether there is a beginning. Whether the evidence clears that low bar and sends everything we've just walked through toward a trial that could put a 21-year-old's life on the line. As of the making of this video, she had not yet ruled. So, will this case even reach trial? If you go by the bar itself, probable cause, the lowest standard the system has, the honest answer is that it very likely will. The defense spent the hearing raising doubt, and they raised real doubt. But raising doubt is a trial strategy. It is not usually enough to stop a case at this stage, especially one carrying DNA evidence, a recorded statement, and a paper trail. Legal analysts watching it expected the case to move forward. But moving forward is not the same as solved. And that is the uncomfortable place this case actually sits. Because everything you heard in that courtroom came from one side. The preliminary hearing is the prosecution's stage. They call the witnesses, they set the order, they build the picture. The defense only cross-examines. David Burke has not put on his own account of what happened. If this reaches trial, everything we walk through today gets tested a second time, against a much higher standard, in front of 12 people instead of one judge. The septillion to one figure will be there. So will the question of who was driving that car. And underneath the legal machinery, there is still Celeste, a 14-year-old girl from Lake Elsinore, reported missing to her local sheriff more than a year before anyone found her. First-generation American, from a family that came here from El Salvador looking for something better for their children. Whatever a jury eventually decides about David Burke, none of it gives her back the birthday she never reached. That is the part no ruling resolves. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want a real answer, not a one-word one. Of everything the court heard, which single piece of evidence do you think matters most? Is it the DNA in the garage? The 1 septillion number that seems impossible to argue with? Is it the recording at the door, the "she told me she was 18"? Or is it the thing the defense exposed, that not one piece of it can say who was actually driving that Tesla? Tell me which one, and tell me why. Because that is the exact question a jury may have to answer, and I genuinely want to know where you land before they do. We'll be watching for Judge Olmedo's ruling, and when it comes, there will be a follow-up. This story is not over. This has been Quiet Record. Verified reporting, named sources, no invented forensics, no gore for clicks. If that's the kind of true crime you've been looking for, the kind that treats a 14-year-old girl as a person and not a headline, then subscribe so the next case finds you. We're building a small community of people who refuse to look away from difficult truths, but refuse to sensationalize them either. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was 14 years old. We'll keep telling this carefully until there's an ending worth telling. Rest easy.